Welcome back, everyone, to our UK Saudi FinTech Week. I hope you've enjoyed the session earlier today and all week. We're now about to start our last session of the day and of the week. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our moderator for the session, Peter Cunnane, who is the National and International Strategy Lead at Innovate Finance. Peter, over to you.
Salim, many thanks for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this final session of this UK Saudi FinTech Week. I am Peter Canaan, the International Strategy Lead at Innovate Finance. In a moment, I'm going to bring in our panel today. We have a great panel to talk to you about the opportunities for partnerships between the UK and Saudi FinTech ecosystems. But before I do, I just want to introduce myself and introduce Innovate Finance. We are the preeminent trade organisation for UK FinTech, based in the UK in London. We represent a number of emerging and also incumbent players within the financial services and innovations industries. And we have worked alongside DIT and the FCO now for a number of years to promote the UK ecosystem for FinTech, to talk about the thought leadership that exists here and to extol the virtues of the FinTech ecosystem in the UK as we seek to make connections around the globe, enhancing our collective FinTech economies. And it's a pleasure to talk to you today. I shall bring in the panel, and each of our panelists today kindly given their time to be with us. I'm going to give them an opportunity at the start of this session just to say a few words about themselves and to talk about their interest in the kingdom and the region. First of all, I would like to bring in Haris Irfan, who is the partner and CFO of Gateway Global and also the chair of the UK Islamic FinTech panel. Haris.
Hi, thanks, Peter. I guess a couple of minutes, a very short introduction to myself. I am a partner and a chief financial officer at Gateway, which is a professional services firm headquartered in the UK, and we operate in the Islamic economy. I also chair something called the UK Islamic FinTech panel, which is an independent organization that connects the Islamic FinTech industry to each other and to international hubs, and works with the British government to help clear policy hurdles and other issues that are affecting Islamic fintechs. I've had about 11 years of my 26 or so in the Gulf, mostly with Deutsche Bank, where I co-founded the Islamic finance team and was also the global head of Islamic finance at Barclays in the Gulf.
Thank you, Haris. Next, I'd also like to bring in Abdul Basit. Abdul is the chairman of Yielders. Abdul.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me. So my background is, having spent a decade in conventional financial services, I moved into the fintech space. One of the first things I was involved with was as part of the founding team of Innovate Finance, where I met Peter. Since then, I've worked across both UK, US, and the Middle East on fintech, working with regulators, policymakers on fintech strategy, but also working in a portfolio career on other projects. One of my roles is as chairman of Yielders, which is the first regulated Islamic fintech in the UK. Alongside Haris, I sit on the UK Islamic fintech panel, and I'm a champion for fintech within the Islamic finance sector as well.
Thank you, Abdul. Next, I'd like to bring in Roxana Mohammadian Molina, who is the CSO at the Blend Network. Roxana. Hi.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm Chief Strategy Officer and board member at Blend Network, which is a London-based fintech company. So Blend Network operates a peer-to-peer property lending platform that essentially connects lenders and borrowers in the property space. So before my career in fintech, I was also an investment banker. I worked at Morgan Stanley and Barclays in the commodities trading teams. I was a strategist in commodities. But going back to the fintech career, so Blend Network is, as I mentioned, a peer-to-peer property lending platform. As everyone knows, during the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, many banks stopped lending to SMEs and to small property developers, and that is really when the whole alternative finance emerged. So we lend money to small and medium property developers in the UK who are building houses, and then obviously our lenders, they register on the platform and they can pick and choose loans that are secured against property, and they can decide how much they want to invest and earn between 8 and 12%. So we are within the alternative finance space. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to discuss the opportunities in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Roxana. And last but certainly by no means least, I'd like to bring in John Liu, who is the Managing Director of Greensill Capital. John.
Hi there, thanks, Peter. Nice to meet you. As Peter said, I'm Managing Director at Greensill Capital. We are a firm that not many people have probably heard of, and yet at the same time, our reach is pretty broad. So myself, I'm an ex-banker as well. So started at Citibank and subsequently was the head of supply chain finance for EMEA at JP Morgan. So I joined Greensill sort of following in the footsteps of one of my ex-bosses who founded the company, Lex Greensill. We're only sort of fairly young in that we were established in 2011. But in that time, we've grown to become the largest global supply chain finance and working capital provider in the world. So we funded just over $150 billion last year to a range of large corporates and their SMEs within their supply chains. Another reason, I guess, for our interest in the Saudi and Middle Eastern market particularly is that over the last year, we've had a couple of investments, and most notably, we had over $1.5 billion invested into our company by SoftBank through their Vision Fund, and of course, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia is a key stakeholder in that. So, not only are we, if you like, a kind of a part of the family of PIF, we're actually have just penned an agreement to become joint venture partners as well. So as part of that, we're establishing offices in Riyadh initially. We've hired a country manager. I've gotten the gig certainly to help establish a pipeline and our presence in the market. And for those that really don't know much about the company, what we do is in essence help to accelerate payments within supply chains. So we help with financing, but by accelerating things like invoice payments or accounts payables for different corporates. So that's a very, very quick snapshot.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for joining today. I think there's a great opportunity with this panel to give a collective view of the opportunities for developing some of those partnerships that we have between our two kingdoms. And what I want to encourage all our attendees, all our audience that are watching right now, to think about if you have any particular questions for the panelists as we go through. We do have a question facility on here, which I will keeping an eye on as the session progresses. If there's a particular point that arises, I'll keep an eye on that and bring in your question. We will allow time for questioning towards the end of the session. So even if you're not immediately have a question to mind, do think about perhaps something you want to put to the panel as we go through this session. To kick things off, I want to encourage the panel to share their views around some of the experiences that they've had engaging either in Saudi or across the region. And I want you to think, perhaps share some of the more positive engagement that you've had, and maybe a view on some of the more interesting developments you've seen in recent years as well. Because I think that's a good place for us to start in terms of how we sort of position what this engagement or what this opportunity could look like as we work through this session. I wonder, Haris, if I could come to you first in terms of your own experiences in any of the roles that you've had. What have you found has been the most positive element to engagement thus far?
Well, I arrived in the region in 2001, and in fact, I've been working on a project out there between London, going back and forth before 2001. And I arrived just before DIFC was getting started, Dubai. Was very commercially aware. It knew how to attract investors, investment banks, and the financial services industry from outside the region. It was very successful at that, and that required a top-down policy. And as a result of that top-down policy, Dubai at the time imported a lot of talent from places like London and New York, and ended up becoming the epicenter of the global Islamic finance industry. So all the innovations that we saw coming out in the last 15 to 20 years have in fact come out of Dubai, with a lot of structurers who were originally in London. So I think that's very instructive, because I see a very similar thing happening now in Saudi with Vision 2030. That suggests a very attractive time for investors from outside of Saudi to be looking at the region. Saudi, of course, has always been the economic powerhouse of the region, and when I was in Dubai, we were traveling back and forth between Riyadh and Jeddah very, very frequently, almost every week, in fact. So I think that what's happening right now suggests a type of top-down policy which is perhaps even more dynamic and engaging than what happened in Dubai in the early 2000s. And perhaps we saw the epicenter of the Islamic finance revolution taking place in the early 2000s. Maybe we'll now see the epicenter of the Islamic fintech industry taking place in Saudi.
And on that point around talent, obviously talent is key to everything, and one of the key planks of the success of fintech here in the UK has been our ability to draw upon talent. Would you say that what we're seeing now in developments in Saudi is comparable in terms of development of talent, whether that's domestically, or is the emphasis more on bringing in overseas talent to support these initial stages?
I think given the sophistication of the fintech industry, one cannot simply create that same level of sophistication overnight. It will take time. And for the time being, therefore, I think collaboration with centers like London and elsewhere are going to be really key to Saudi's success in this industry. So I think the more we look at partnerships and collaboration, marrying up capital with talent and tech, I think that will be the key. One cannot simply grow in isolation. One needs to have partners and help along the way. So I can see it happening well within a generation, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you. Abdul, if I could come to you next with the same question around positive engagement and your experience across the region.
Yeah, so my experience has sort of been in 4 key areas. So firstly, with policymakers and regulators, I think there's been a huge appetite to mirror some of the success we've seen in the fintech community in the UK, and lots of effort and top-down policy initiatives being put in place to help support the ecosystem and develop the ecosystem in the region. Obviously, Saudi is possibly the newest to that compared to its neighbours. However, some of the moves that we've seen SAMA make over the last year in terms of the payments infrastructure and now the sandbox are very important signals for the community. And so that sort of brings me on to the second set of folks, which are the key players within the industry. That's the banks and the fintechs. And the engagement with the banks has been an interesting one, where they do have an appetite. They do recognize the potential for fintech, but they've so far been hesitant to do much because they were unsure as to what the regulatory frameworks were going to be put in place. I think now that those are starting to happen, the banks will be more engaged. And the fintechs, I think there is very strong grassroots activity within the region as well. So things like the sandbox are really helpful in bringing that to the fore. I think the other 2 areas where the interaction has been sort of a bit more hit and miss. From a yielder's perspective, I think we see a strong consumer demand from Saudi. So we're a property investment platform investing in real estate assets here in the UK on behalf of our investors. We have a significant volume of investors that invest from Saudi into UK real estate. So there is demand for wealth management, alternative finance type solutions in the Saudi market. So that's encouraging. I think on the investment side, investors investing into the fintech ecosystem, I think that on that side, the experience has probably been slightly less positive. I think the investment community has yet to catch up to the potential of fintech in the region. I think, in the previous panel that you had today, there was a lot of UK fintech investors bringing their expertise into the region. I think, we know that the region is not short of capital, but it's the mechanisms to deploy that into technology that I think are underdeveloped. And I think that's where the UK can possibly play a role, because that's a journey that we've been through to support the UK fintech ecosystem.
It is indeed, and a journey that we're still working through as well. You mentioned there, leading on to my next question, really, in terms of some of the barriers around opportunities to trade and investment and the banking and the banking industry's willingness to get engaged as a point. I wondered if I could bring John in at this point, because you mentioned in your opening remarks your recent engagement in the region is positive, and certainly having more of a sense of the investment scene there. Are there any sort of critical barriers that you've come across very recently, particularly on that side?
Yeah, so I think I would probably first, by prefacing it by saying, we've had a really fantastic experience in countries to date. I think from our perspective, to some degree, we're in a little bit of a privileged position in that, through our partnership with with our local partners, SoftBank, and also with the Public Investment Fund, the level of access and the portfolio of opportunities that are presenting themselves are sort of second to none. I mean, you only have to look at projects like Neon, which is going to be 33 times the size of New York City, and there's nothing like that in the world. I mean, Qadir is also similar. I mean, it's 3 times the size of what Disney Florida is going to be. So there are unique projects and then unique opportunities. I think from our perspective, I wouldn't say necessarily they've been blockages for us, but there are hurdles to doing business in country. And I think, first and foremost, as a fintech player, I think there are sort of existing regulations that apply to traditional banking, which don't lend themselves so easily to kind of a fintech scenario. And I know that there are sandbox licenses and that and the regulator has been actually really good. I think there were about 9 fintech licenses that were issued during Ramadan. But in essence, for example, what we do is very different to what a traditional lender would do, and also very different to a pure technology kind of ERP system. And so we use data to drive payments. So there's a kind of a knowledge gap that exists. But on the other hand, I would say both Summer and the counterparties we've dealt with are all very sophisticated, and and they don't need long, but we need to just explain this is what the new technology or the new innovation is that we're deploying in other parts of the world, and they're very open to lending that to the local economy, because clearly, as Abdul said, as part of Vision 2030, there's a desire for real innovation to drive away from the dependency on traditional kind of means of business. I think the other elements are probably more around cultural, and just in terms of being more in country. And so clearly COVID hasn't really helped our situation with not being able to travel and be in country, but I think definitely there's a very strong relationship element to being doing business in country. But I would say that we've been very lucky so far in just in terms of the relationships we've had.
Roxana, I know you've been working with a number of partners across the region, and also in Saudi Arabia in particular. Just wanted to get your take as well in terms of your engagement, your experiences working through those organisations, alongside those organisations, and on what observations you have around the opportunity.
Yes, no, for sure, because I have been recently, as you mentioned, working quite a lot, with different stakeholders in the region, especially here in the UK with the Saudi British Joint Business Council, the JBC, on establishing on a project that is a very exciting project, is the UK Saudi Tech Hub. And so on that we have been, reaching out and speaking to a lot of stakeholders, both in Saudi and also in the UK. And so I think in terms of my experience working with partners in the region, I would focus on three things. The first thing is it is a very dynamic region, and in terms of its nascent startup ecosystem, and particularly in the fintech area. So is that type of place that every time that I go in, there's new initiatives, new companies, and it's very, very dynamic. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, participants and that in that ecosystem that are very, very, we all know the statistics, the very young population, but very tech savvy, and we heard earlier this week the incredible statistics of internet penetration and so on, and it's very entrepreneurial minded a population that really willing to try new ideas and test new concepts and new models. But the key point for me in the region is the high level support from the top down, and from institutions that we see for supporting the startup ecosystem and the entrepreneurial ecosystem, particularly in fintech. Obviously, fintech has been a recurring theme in Saudi Arabia since initially the Vision 2030 was announced in 2016. But I think now it has really come to the top of the agenda again with the events of this year, and diversifying the economy away from oil and into more technologically driven economy. So I think that the really important thing is the high level, top-down support for this initiative, and that is very important. And we've seen, as it was mentioned before, examples, the approval by the CMA of the financial technology experiment and the sandbox and so on. And I think this level of support is very important.
Indeed, and as we've seen in the UK, certainly over the last 5-10 years, that top-down support from government, from regulators and other key stakeholders has been very, very instrumental to our own success in fintech.
I think it's one of the conditions for the success, as you mentioned, really having that support.
Absolutely, and you brought that to the fore there, and Harris mentioned earlier the example of Dubai as well, and some of the early work that was done there. What's really important about, I suppose, an organisation like mine and our engagement with government and the work that we do to support policies and the right regulatory ecosystem is obviously identifying the challenges that businesses face and the barriers to trade, whether it's overseas or whether it's scaling at home. I wondered if I could ask you all to think about, what are the particular barriers that you've encountered? You've mentioned already on the capital side. Has anyone had any real experience with regulatory challenges, whether it's in Saudi or other neighbouring countries, that you think is relevant to address here?
I can talk from the peer-to-peer sector because obviously the peer-to-peer sector is a tightly regulated area, and with very, very justifiably, because we, at other platforms, we have a lot of retail investors and retail lenders, and obviously they require a very higher level and different level of protection. So the FCA really has, we think has done a great job in regulating the peer-to-peer sector and in creating the trust in the sector. Because frankly, over the past years, peer-to-peer has sometimes struggled with reputational issues, and so the FCA has done a great job in regulating the sector. And in fact, we know that last year they stepped up, the rules and the regulations for the peer-to-peer sector. In the December 2019, they introduced a new set of rules and regulations, such as, for example, the appropriateness test, which before that it was not necessary for the platforms to perform an appropriateness test, although platforms like ourselves, for example, we always had that, even when it wasn't required. But so having those new measures for us, we think is a good thing. for bringing trust into the sector. And I think looking at the Saudi market, this is one of the points that we are, pushing and arguing that is one of the key attractiveness for a partnership between Saudi Arabia and the UK market is really to be able to adapt obviously to the Saudi market, the regulatory work that the FCA has done for the UK market, because we think it has done a great job, and that has been translated into the success of the UK fintech industry. We think big part of the success is due to the regulatory work. So that is one of the areas where we think that a partnership between Saudi Arabia and the UK would really focus on adapting those rules and regulations to the particular circumstances of the Saudi market.
Indeed. Haris, I wonder if I could bring you back in on that point as well, particularly around the issue of building those sorts of relationships with the ecosystem and trust being a key part of that. Any thoughts on that point?
Well, yeah, one of the things that we work very hard on at the UK Islamic FinTech panel is to create connections with international FinTech hubs, particularly in the Gulf. I think I'd have an interesting counterpoint to what Roxana said earlier about the dynamism within the region, the tech savviness, the entrepreneurialism. Yes, one does see pockets of that. We have seen examples of that, and I quoted the DIFC as one example of that. And I'm hoping that Vision 2030 will be even better than that. But I have to say that actually, and this is coming back to Abdul's earlier point, the level of sophistication from traditional financial services institutions has not been great as far as fintech is concerned. I think there's been a lot of Me Tooism, which is jumping on the fintech bandwagon and saying we're going to invest a lot of money in fintech, when actually what's happening is they are investing in their IT departments. Now that's not fintech. That's just making your existing operations a bit more operationally efficient. And that's technology as an enabler, not as a disruptor. And what I'm really talking about is, real change. In Europe, the US, and elsewhere in the world, we are seeing the growth of challenger banks, very different types of financial services institutions. And that is quite a different mindset from the mindset that we generally see in many parts of the Gulf. Now, I think that is changing. I hope that we will see a broad change across all sectors that will move away from safe, solid public sector jobs towards more private sector oriented, more entrepreneurial, more dynamic jobs. But, as I say, I don't think initially the investment is going to come from traditional banking organizations. So as I work in Islamic fintech, I look at the traditional Islamic banks, and typically their investment activities are confined to, for example, real estate. They like to see, touch and feel bricks and mortar. And so they buy commercial real estate in the US and the UK with a 6% yield. And that's all fine, but that's not the investment mindset of investing in early stage entrepreneurial tech companies that work in the financial sector. So I think there's still a bit of work to be done. And what we do at the panel is to try and connect those international hubs. So as I say, we marry up the capital, the investors and the entrepreneurs together.
So sorry, John, go ahead.
sorry. I was just going to make the point. I mean, it's an interesting point because, and maybe there's a differentiation between level of sophistication and desire to push forward at a central versus at a kind of a more localized level at a corporate level. Because, I mean, if I look at sort of, the strides that have been made, I mean, they've had 2 FIIs, where the great and the good have been brought here. We've got all these big projects that I've mentioned, Neom Kadir, but there's also, the Red Sea. There's been also a range of investment, from the overall, public investment fund. I think there is a desire at a central level, to really, I think, push forward. And maybe that differentiation is that level of sophistication exists there, but at a corporate level, it's still regionally focused. And maybe that's the change that needs to kind of maybe, make the next leap forward.
I think the thing I'd add to that is it all depends what you're trying to achieve. So, you know, I'm probably less harsh than Harris is on some of the banks. I think some of the effort that they need to do up front is hygiene, that it needs to be done before they can move forward. But from an ecosystem perspective, I think, Peter, you know, you and I will recognize that there's various pillars to an ecosystem that need to be developed in tandem. And we talked about capital. Regulation is another one. I think you know, the one thing that people miss about the UK and the sort of boom in fintech in the UK is that a lot of the incentive and the driver for that was regulatory change. And so, you know, regulatory change can have that impact in the region as well. I think in my experience, looking at some of the other countries in the region, some of that has been very progressive early on. Unfortunately, a lot of that has then morphed into vanity projects that don't really do much to encourage more grassroots activity within the region. I think it depends on your objectives. If you're looking to attract some of the larger fintechs around the world, you'll definitely do that. And I think, you know, Greensill, you know, addressing Saudi Arabia, I think is a natural thing that will happen. You will get large players coming in. But you know, if you want to attract some of the other fintechs who maybe aren't as large, who are applicable to the region, I think you have some real progressive regulation to enable that. One of the things that I've been championing for quite some time is regulatory interoperability within the region. Not every fintech has the means or the capacity to be regulated in every single GCC country. They all obviously want to access Saudi Arabia as a large market, but there is potential in other markets as well. So perhaps some interoperability with regulation across the region would entice more companies to look at the regions more seriously as a holistic move rather than country by country. And I think that's certainly holding the region back at the moment.
And that point around the interoperability, and I like your point, Abdul, around the sense that perhaps many countries starting out on their regulatory journey are quite progressive to begin with. Do you get a sense that maybe that some countries do pull back from that, and it does harm that initial momentum?
I think it's not so much pullback. I think it's perhaps then deploy the wrong tactics. So I think one of the advantages that countries have that are looking at fintech seriously now is, you know, in the UK we've been doing it for a number of years. So there are things we've done well, there's things we've not done very well, and there's an opportunity to actually look at the things that have worked, not just in the UK but in other parts of the world where there is a buoyant fintech ecosystem, and almost leapfrog and catch up by not making the same mistakes that we've perhaps made. But all too often, I think it becomes seen to be doing the right thing rather than doing the right thing.
Right. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's been an issue when we've looked at how perhaps other markets have looked to the UK and perhaps have misunderstood the sort of depth of support that there has been in the UK for regulatory change for quite some time. Roxana, I can bring you back in. I'll give you an opportunity to answer Harris's point as well around the talent within the industry and perhaps where it's being reflected. But also wanted to get your view as well on the P2P segment in particular, and is there an opportunity there, particularly around regulation of that industry?
Yes, for sure. On the peer-to-peer sector, obviously you have different types of peer-to-peer, SME lending, you know, consumer lending, invoice finance lending. We do property lending, and it's interesting that in the Saudi market you have already started to see a lot of these peer-to-peer lending emerge. I was there in January and met a really exciting company, Lendo. They do invoice financing, and they were actually one of the first companies to be included in the sandbox. So it's very exciting to see that the peer-to-peer sector is starting to emerge in Saudi Arabia, and I think I see a particular opportunity for the property sector and the real estate sector, because obviously in the UK the reason for that to emerge was, as I said, in 2008 and 9 banks stopped lending to property developers, so for the development phase, essentially for the short-term lending. And I think well, I mean, it is a similar situation in other markets and in the Saudi market, and because of the tradition of infrastructure projects and real estate and so on, I see an opportunity in the particular property peer-to-peer sector. So it's good that we have already started to see those companies emerge. But I really think, I really, have been advocating this for a while, and now, as I mentioned, we are working on this project about the UK Saudi Tech Hub, which essentially is I think is a great opportunity to really collaborate, and I see it around 4 pillars really: a deal flow, the deal flow hub, partnerships and research. Because yes, it was mentioned that the UK obviously has had a lot of successes, and perhaps also things that less success. But overall, I think it has been a success story, and particularly on the regulatory side, and also on specific initiatives that they are not specific to fintech, but they are more for the general startup ecosystem, such as the EIS and SCIS scheme. And I think this is important because in Saudi Arabia, traditionally investors were, large institutional investors, but we are starting to increasingly see a lot of angel investors. Every time I go there, and even we have events here in London, we see a lot of angel investors. So having those tax advantages scheme similar to the UK's EIS and SCIS, I think would be great initiatives to be able to diversify the investor base in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Roxana. And on that point around the building up of the investment ecosystem, we talk about the growth of angel. We talk about, we have the EIS and the SEIS here in the UK, of course, has been very successful. John, I know you're concerned probably more with the broader corporate and lending to SME base in terms of investment. What you've already talked about the opportunities you've seen. What are perhaps the challenges that you foresee for the market going forward?
I think it's an interesting one. So we sort of see, if you like, there are 2 or 3 different sets of customers that we have. I mean, the first and ultimate customer is the supplier, or the physical supply chain, that needs funding. And so our job is to make that as efficient as possible and help to essentially optimize and squeeze the benefit out. And so we deal with large corporates, and I won't name them, but some of the largest companies in the kingdom. And similarly, we deal with their smaller SME supply chains. And then on the other side of it is the funders, or a raft of different pockets of liquidity that we dip into to help fund these particular supply chains. And so in terms of our existing model, where we do a lot of our what we call distribution or selling of assets and getting the funding, a lot of that at the moment happens outside of the kingdom, predominantly from the UK and into kind of either established high street banks we all know, or different asset managers and different investors. And so within the kingdom, there is an education process that we probably need to do to educate, the investor market here as to what particular assets we have, how they work and why they are attractive, to those investors in the UK or in Europe and in America relative to the kingdom. So we're having conversations already with regional banks, but there are family offices, institutional investors, so we're sort of at the tip of the iceberg there in terms of getting that education process and knowledge out. But once they get it, then it's about, I guess the other element is, do they look at applying their existing policies and models to invest, or do they have to create new ones? And I think there's going to be probably a hybrid of those two.
Indeed. And as we move towards thinking about the opportunities and the future connections that we can make, what suggestions would you have would any of our panelists have with regard to facilitating reciprocal market access for UK Saudi fintechs, and how can we perhaps test out the sort of connections we want to build before we get into the specifics around how licenses are granted and so on. I want to also thank Chris Innes-Hopkins for submitting that question, quick reminder that we have a few minutes left for questions if anyone else who's watching has a burning question they want to ask. Can I just put that to the panel? What do we do to build on the opportunities and develop those reciprocal opportunities?
Maybe if I can have a quick. Sorry, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh.
Roxana, why don't you go ahead?
No, Roxana.
I was just going to mention, I mean, for me, I think, a clear framework for collaboration would be very important. And this UK Saudi Tech Hub that I mentioned, that we are working very much with the British Saudi Joint Business Association. So essentially, is having a regular framework that serves as a vehicle for exchange of ideas and for collaboration, and as a hub essentially to be able to connect entrepreneurs in both regions and to be able to learn from the experience of each other. So I think for me it's just having, because you already have a lot of collaboration between companies in Saudi Arabia and in the UK, but I think having a strong framework and also supported by obviously the different stakeholders at the higher level, because as I mentioned before, I think one of the keys for the success really of the sector is the high level support, is the top-down support from the stakeholders. So the collaboration within the framework of the UK Saudi Tech Hub that is supported by high level stakeholders, that would be very important to be able to learn from each other's experiences, for Saudi Arabia to leverage on the things that the UK has done right in terms of regulation, in terms of having big stakeholders such as Innovate Finance, the voice for the fintech industry and so on. I think that would be a key aspect for me.
Thank you, Roxana. Harris.
Well, I'm really pleased to hear about the UK Saudi Tech Hub. That sounds like an excellent initiative. And I can perhaps draw some parallels with what we've been trying to do, Abdul and I, in the UK with the UK Islamic Fintech panel. When we set it up, we were very clear that we did not want to have a talking shop. So we didn't want to have a lot of people, holding a lot of conferences and seminars and feeling good about themselves. Actually, what we wanted to do was to have some very clear commercial deliverables. So year by year, we've established a theme and we've tried to execute against that theme. So for example, some of the commercial deliverables that have come about as a result of connecting the industry through the panel have been things like fundraising exercises for specific companies, or for example, have been the creation of an Islamic economy accelerator called IE5, which helps a lot of those companies to start up and set up and raise money. So these were very specific deliverables rather than an opportunity for a random collection, a very large random collection of people to assemble and essentially talk a lot. And we wanted to move away from that sort of fashionable conference event seminar type setup towards something that actually sits down and discusses specific commercially deliverable projects.
I couldn't agree more, I think, with that, Harris, really, because generally, in the industry, we see a lot of, you call them talk events, which I completely agree, and nothing concrete being done. So I completely agree with you that, it has to be coming from a framework of having specific KPIs and deliverables and getting things done, and those KPIs being it in terms of specific partnerships, quantifiable and measurable KPIs. Completely agree.
I think also in terms of opportunities, as we
Abdul, I think you're frozen there.
Yeah, I can't see him either, so I assume it's at his end.
His end, yes. Abdul, do wave if you can rejoin us. From
the early days of fintech in the UK, it took a while for the banks to get on side and to be on that rather. Sorry, did you lose me there for a second?
No, we lost you mid-sentence there. Why don't you start that point again? Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll say that again. So I think what I was saying was that I think we recognised from the early days of fintech in the UK that it took a while for the banks to get on side and really participate within the ecosystem. And I think John touched on it, saying that there are pools of capital that will that they'll be looking at deploying through Greensill as they enter the market in Saudi Arabia. I think one of the things that we have to appreciate is that the UK, the sort of fintech growth in the UK was a pre-open banking phenomenon, and in Saudi is likely to be a post-open banking phenomenon. So the opportunity for banks to get involved early in the development of that ecosystem and in terms of scaling fintech solutions is significantly better than it was in the UK in the early days. So I think that really is an opportunity. I think open banking will really push the envelope, and I think it's already started to sort of penetrate in the region in places like Bahrain. But once that takes hold in Saudi, once there's some sort of regulatory imperative to enforce that and give the bank some incentive to participate, I think then that really creates an opportunity. And for fintechs like Yielders, that's a real opportunity for us to we as a fintech that has a scaling ambition. Looking at the levers that we can deploy, and seeing open banking as one of those levers to access a large retail consumer base is something that we're very, very keen on in the UK and elsewhere. So I think having a good open banking policy as well as another leapfrog strategy will really help the region to catch up and for the banks to participate in the fintech evolution.
Thank you, Abdul, and thank you for bringing up the open banking point. I think what we've seen experienced in the UK and what we've seen in other parts of the world as well are those, as you put them, leapfrog strategies, those accelerator points for the market to fast forward, or in some cases to catch up with developers elsewhere. I think that's a really important point to make. Given where Saudi Arabia is now, we've heard about the 2030 vision. And what parameters do you think there are when we look at perhaps some of the socio-economic impacts of bringing through more inclusive financial products and policies? And at the moment, I'm saying this at a time when, as a world, we're looking at the impact of COVID-19 and how we perhaps accelerate some of our more progressive thinking around opportunities for development of products and services to reach perhaps those parts of our societies that such products have not reached before. And I think about how fintech in the UK is looking to connect with the unbanked or the not banked at all. Any thoughts on that, and any thoughts perhaps how that could be incorporated into the vision for the next 10 years?
I see that there was a lot of nodding going around amongst the panelists. So again, if Abdul will permit, because I know that I'm pretty sure I know what he's going to say because we've been working on these things together. I'll take a quick first stab and then allow everyone to comment. Something very interesting is happening in the UK right now. So since the start of the year, I've probably had around, and I'm sure Abdul has as well, I've had around 12 or so conversations around a digital Islamic challenger bank. So of course, my focus is very much Islamic finance, but the number of conversations in that area tells me that there's a wider conversation, not just for Muslims, but for those who are looking at ethical financing alternatives. And within those conversations, we're not just talking about traditional banking services, current accounts and savings accounts and home financing products. We're also talking about things like social inclusion, endowments, awqaf, charitable activities, reaching the underbanked and the unbanked. And these are conversations that are being tied up together in the form of a single financial services organization that can provide tech-enabled financial services. So Abdul, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just sort of say, of all the things we talk about in fintech, this is the thing that probably excites me the most, because if you look at Saudi Arabia and sort of the macro issues, Saudi Arabia is a very different market to the other GCC countries in that it's a large population. There is some level of sort of socioeconomic breakdown between the top and the bottom. In other countries, there's indigenous population and there's migrant workers and a small layer in between. So the challenges, I think, from a macro level are bigger in Saudi Arabia. And what's really interesting is that Islamic finance really has the modes of finance for more equitable distribution of wealth and capital. And so, you know, it's really interesting to me how fintechs who are based on the sort of the principles of Islamic finance, how they can really help challenge that that status quo. I think, you know, Saudi Arabia has not been short of wealth over the last few decades, and predominantly deploying a conventional finance mindset hasn't really solved any of those socioeconomic challenges. So I think it's possibly a chance for Islamic finance 2.0. I think Harris will, you know, appreciate that, you know, in the first wave of Islamic finance, there was a certain level of advancement that was done and then sort of plateaued. Now I think there's a chance for a second wave, and I think fintechs really have a role to play in that, because as we'll all appreciate, you know, on this panel, that there's more innovation happening outside of the banks than there is inside of the banks in most cases, and you know, that really is an opportunity as Saudi Arabia starts to address some of these socioeconomic challenges.
Thank you both. John, if I just bring you in as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
around the future.
No worries. I was just going to say, just to sort of build on those points. You know, we've certainly seen, and not just within the kingdom, but generally, a real drive for sort of you know, finance structures that are linked more to the ESG agendas of different corporates. You know, and actually no more so of late than retailers and grocers, and you know, people wanting, you know, finance, you know, even to the extent of, you know, you will get preferential rates if you can show a really strong ESG kind of KPI or scorecard. And that's one area perhaps that I haven't as yet seen a strong push within the kingdom yet, insofar as, you know, whilst there's a view to push towards innovation, you know, on the ESG side, there hasn't been sort of a strong linkage towards sustainability, for example, you know, as being you know, a key driver for why they want to do things. But that's not to say, maybe that's just because at the moment the focus is on economic kind of improvement, socioeconomic improvement, and maybe not you know, well, I don't know how this actually, you know, translates, but one of the products that we have, which we do in the UK, is we actually allow for employees even to get paid their salary, you know, after they've earned it, rather than waiting till the end of the month. And that's at no cost to them. And so, you know, given you've got a population in the kingdom where there's a really strong, you know, migrant workforce, and a desire for, you know, kind of maybe improving the quality of living and you know, the benefits to that you know, maybe lower earning population, you know, it's those kind of, you know, new innovations that we can bring in from maybe from abroad that might be of great help to the local kingdom.
Roxana, something?
Yes, because actually, so financial inclusion, I think, really sits at the center of peer-to-peer lending, because just the way the model works. So, you know, our platform investors register, and they can pick and choose loans. They can invest any amount they want from £1,000. We have, you know, some of our investors, one of our equity investors, he's a co-founder of a 40 billion hedge fund, so he would invest obviously large amount of money. But we have retail investors, £1,000. So that, you know, democratization of investing through a peer-to-peer platform, I think, is very important. So someone with £1,000 to invest in the past would not have access to the same type of deals that they, you know, a partner or a 1 billion hedge fund would have access. But in a peer-to-peer setup, they are actually co-investing on the same deal, and they are investing under the same conditions. And I think this applies obviously to peer-to-peer everywhere, but it's particularly relevant, I think, also to Saudi Arabia, because, as I mentioned, we are seeing an increasing emergence of angel investors. So while traditionally you had a lot of the big, you know, players, the big institutional investors, now you have investors who are, I mean, not retail, but you know, angel investors. So that opening of the opportunities for them to be able to co-invest with the larger institutional investors, family offices, I think is a huge opportunity.
Yep, and I think there's an opportunity across the piece to look further. I think at that particular point around inclusion and around the groups that we want to include, and the opportunities, Roxana, as you say, we want to open up through different segments of fintech. I think that's going to be very important for growth for all of us, and something that we're looking at Innovate Finance here in the UK right now against the backdrop of the current crisis that we all face. I have a couple of minutes left. I just wondered if we could go around the panel one last time. Any final thoughts around opportunities for the future, things that you would love or dear to see happen? Harris.
At the risk of repeating myself, I think that the idea of a global Islamic digital challenger bank is very, very exciting, and that's borne out by all the conversations that I've been having over the past 6 months or so. I really do think that that is, as Abdul says, Islamic Finance 2.0. And I hope this time around it will go well beyond talking about just a quarter of the population and talk about everybody. Because Islamic Finance is not for Muslims, it's for everyone. And there are elements of it which are universal across, many faiths and philosophies. And they're, good universal standards of ethics. So I think that one can incorporate many elements of ESG, of socially responsible investing, of Islamic finance, and of other faiths into one holistic alternative financing methodology. So those are conversations that I think are going to be very, very key to what happens in the next few months and years. And I think that the collaborations that are taking place between London in particular and other parts of the world like Saudi are going to be key to that, because I can see that the first stage of these tech organizations is going to start in a place like London and then branch out to somewhere like Saudi.
Yeah. Thank you, Miles. John?
Oh, sorry, just unmuting there. So I think from my perspective, what's going to drive significant flow in commerce is a sense of trust and transparency and reliability, and not that it doesn't exist at all in the kingdom today, but I think if you look at Dubai and how it's really been able to sort of accelerate its efforts to modernize and really become a hub for the region in terms of international trade, a similar kind of free zone, which I know they're looking at anyway for the King Abdul Financial District. But I think that's sort of a scenario would prove to be attractive, and also very, very much allow for more companies that maybe have some reservations historically to actually think about, well, actually that's now a place I can reliably do business in. So something like that would be, I think, very powerful.
Thank you, John. Roxana?
From my perspective, as I said before, I think that the time is really ripe for bringing all these different moving parts of the collaboration that already exist at a company level between many different companies and many different players, to bring that all together under a unique umbrella, under a unique framework of a UK Saudi tech hub, an initiative that is being driven by the Saudi British Joint Business Council. I think it has already a lot of support. We had an event in March just before the lockdown. It's like feels ages ago. It was a smart city, UK Saudi smart city event, and we saw really the level of support for that initiative, both across the private and the public sector organizations, and I think that would be, that would be what I would like to see.
Thank you, Roxana. And Abdul?
I think for me, the thing I'd like to see, or I think I have least confidence in right now, which I think needs to change, is the way capital is deployed in the region into early stage tech. So this could be a number of things. So firstly, the way capital is deployed to really early stage businesses in terms of equity investment, I think is very poor in the region right now, and needs to improve, especially if there is to be more grassroots development, especially in the fintech space. And then I think, as three of the five panelists here are alternative finance firms. The deployment of capital into alternative finance, I think, is really key, especially in an economy that's looking to diversify away from traditional sectors and really grow the SME space. I think that's going to be key across the whole economy.
That's great, Abdul. Thank you. I'm afraid I have to leave it there. I have a couple of questions come in last minute. I will disseminate those to the panelists to see if we can get an answer after the session. So thank you for those. I want to thank all my panelists, Abdul, Harris, Roxana, John, for your thoughts this afternoon and for your time as well. That's been a very interesting and insightful conversation around the possibilities for partnership and engagement, and certainly a lot of lessons that I will be taking back to Innovate Finance as I look at our international role as well. So thank you for that. I want to just hand over finally to Chad Woodward, who is going to wrap up for us. Chad, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. My name's Chad Woodward. I'm the Director of Trade and Investment at the British Embassy in Riyadh. So I'm just going to literally take 2 minutes to wrap up after this week. Wow, it has been an incredible and fascinating week of dialogue on this hugely important sector, never more relevant than in the light of COVID. At the start of the week, we heard from the Saudi government about their commitment to the Vision 2030 transformation plan and how financial services is really at the heart of that plan. On day 2, we had a brilliant panel session with practitioners who are already working in fintech in Saudi, in the telecoms, banking and investment community. So we heard firsthand a business perspective on the opportunities, but also the challenges in this very large and untapped market filled with tech-savvy consumers. And then yesterday, we had a fascinating dialogue between our 2 regulatory communities. I was particularly excited about the concept of open banking that we've pioneered in the UK as a key driver of fintech innovation, and the prospect for the industry in Saudi if it were to be delivered here. I actually think with Saudi's vision and ambition, you would probably take it a lot further than we have, for example, into digital identity and a whole new economy which that could open up. And today, finally, we've heard from a stellar cast of panelists about how to partner and invest in the UK. But it doesn't end here. We want to see a thriving and well-regulated fintech industry in Saudi, working in partnership with UK Fintech, investment and regulator communities. So if you're a UK or Saudi company interested in fintech, or you work in the policy space in either country, please do get in touch with the British Embassy for advice, support, and also the introductions that we can make, and to join one of our trade missions or dialogues. So I'm going to end it there. All that remains for me to do is to thank, firstly, our Saudi partners, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Investment and Fintech Saudi, our UK partners, the City of London Corporation, Fintech Alliance, and the Saudi British Joint Business Council, and special thanks to our delivery partner, AEI Saudi, and particularly Yazan Shuker, who's been critical in helping us. And a final thanks goes to my team at the British Embassy, who with Yazan have laid all this on. So Salim, Sarah, Fatima and Iro, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you in the audience. Hope you have a great weekend.